Good afternoon. Yeah? Good afternoon. Welcome to the St. Joseph Arts Society. Pick a seat, a plush leather couch, something in turquoise. There's leather with Roman numerals. You can bring your drinks. We're going to get started in 1 minute. Thanks.
Hello, California. So I want to just take a few minutes to say thank you to all of you for being part of this amazing opportunity we have to launch in California. But I want to put it a little bit in context by going back in history a bit. So let's go back to 1910, when Hiram Johnson had just been elected governor on an agenda to expand democracy and strictly regulate the tech industry. You think I'm kidding, but of course he meant the railroads. And at the time, California was going through a rough patch. It was recovering from the bombing of the LA Times building in Southern California, which had been quite tragic. And international news coverage was highlighting how this tragedy in California was connected to labor unrest involving the steel and iron industry. Across the country, Andrew Carnegie was taking a break from building libraries. And he was talking to his closest associate, former Secretary of State Elihu Root, and they were cooking up a plan. And the plan was to use some of the wealth that had come to Carnegie from selling the steel company that had been building steel for the railroad companies, and using it to create a new kind of institution that did not exist yet in the United States or the world. An institution that would use research, relationships, knowledge to bring the world closer together and promote cooperation. So it was that the Carnegie Endowment was born in 1910 and became, eventually, the first truly global think tank. A think tank that had offices not only in Washington, D.C., but in Brussels, in Beirut, in Delhi, in places like Singapore. What all those places have in common, though, is that they're national capitals, until today. This is the start of a new chapter in the Carnegie Endowment's history that highlights the need for our mission to go and run through subnational regions, places that are connected to the world, places that have diasporas, places that are the fount of extraordinary ideas, but also struggle with extraordinary inequality and are burdened by it, of ecology and of wealth and of opportunity. What we hope to do here in California is to build on an opportunity that is probably never as useful and crucial as it is now, where our mission, bringing the world together, helping governments work effectively, runs through what happens in this place, which is a window on the world. Think about it. 48 hours ago, President Biden was about 1.5 miles away from here because the world is impacted by the technologies that are being tested, developed, and critiqued here in California. We speak 200 languages in California. We have connections to every corner of the planet. As they have done all over the world, our scholars are going to build infrastructure, connecting action and thought, connecting people in this room, in effect, to a set of ideas and research about how decisions that are made regionally affect people from Fresno to Finland, about how to deal with the changes in democracy and technology, about how to make the climate crisis an opportunity rather than a tragedy. All of that depends on connecting the notion of a world that we know exists and we can treat as not always something we can change, but also an imagination. How can we build a world that is different using knowledge, using research? Everybody in this room knows that it would be naive to think that research, that relationships, that dialogue will suddenly make the air quality in Bakersfield as good as in Beverly Hills or get rid of nuclear weapons. But we've been at this for 100 years, for more than that, and we can tell you that ideas and research presented right to the right policymakers make a difference in the world. And it doesn't take somebody who loves California as much as I do to know that our mission runs through what happens in this part of the world. And the world is going to get through the next unruly and crazy decades only if it understands what's happening in the west of the United States. Hiram Johnson might have asked us what took it so long to happen. To be fair, Andrew Carnegie was building libraries. He built 142 of them here in California, beginning in 1899. And there is a town named after Andrew Carnegie in the Central Valley. But that's not enough. This is a new chapter, a new opportunity, and with your help, we hope to make it count, and we are grateful to you for being a part of it. And now, it's my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce somebody who gets our mission, has been supportive of our project here in California from the beginning, Lieutenant Governor Eleni Kounalakis. As many of you know, the Lieutenant Governor is not only a senior constitutional official, but she is responsible for representing California and carrying the international portfolio for California. So she gets why we're here. She is a person with enormous experience as a diplomat. She was one of the youngest ambassadors in the United States when she served in Budapest. She was the leader of a major company that did housing development across the state. She chaired Governor Brown's International Affairs and Trade Council, and she is passionate about the sorts of things that Californians care about, from homelessness to early childhood education to improving our infrastructure. So please welcome the Lieutenant Governor of California.
Thank you very much, President Cuellar, for that warm welcome. And I couldn't quite hear from behind the microphone whether or not he mentioned, but I think most of you know that President Cuellar also served on the California State Supreme Court as a justice of the court, and I want to thank him for his service to California in that capacity. Truly, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace is so fortunate to have him as a leader now and for everything Carnegie is doing to make the world a safer and better place. It's also a great pleasure for me to welcome back to California Deputy Secretary Adamo and Senior Official Salinas, and to see, of course, our friend, Dr. Frank Fukushima, who is here at Stanford. Welcome. I'm thrilled to be with you all to help inaugurate the endowment's new California Center. I cannot overstate how proud we are to be the first and so far the only domestic outpost for such a prestigious and influential organization. And let me just say that I agree completely with President Cuellar in the reasoning for establishing this new center on the West Coast, and more specifically here in our state. As the promotional material that you have presented points out correctly, California is a subnational jurisdiction with an economy and population significantly larger than most nation states. With a GDP last year of $3.6 trillion, we would rank as the 5th largest economy in the world if we were an independent country, behind only the United States, China, Japan, and Germany. With nearly 40 million people, we are the largest state by population, and we are also the largest consumer market in the country. Also, as your materials point out, our diversity, combined with our world-class public and private universities, our national laboratories, and the California spirit of innovation that defines our private sector, we are home to an ecosystem of innovation that has changed the world. It is an ecosystem that impacts behavioral patterns, economies, and governments. As Governor Newsom likes to say, California is the world's coming attraction. And finally, we are also a global actor. Again, quoting out of your brochure, we are a global actor that has embraced the notion that subnational diplomacy has an important role to play in the realm of international relations. All these factors are why, over 4 years ago, Governor Newsom and I agreed that we would work together to focus California's international engagement and elevate our state's voice and presence on the world stage. Very quickly, we established 3 main international priorities. First, to bolster and increase trade and investment with our foreign partners. Second, to become a leading advocate for the importance of embracing immigration as a source of economic and cultural vitality. And third, to play a leading role globally in efforts to combat climate change. In the field of trade, California leads the way. It is estimated that 1 in 4 jobs in our state is directly tied to foreign trade, investment, or international tourism. Approximately 40% of all containers entering the United States pass through our ports in Long Beach and LA. We are number 1 in the country in attracting foreign direct investment. We entered the pandemic as the 5th largest economy in the world, and we came out of it on the cusp of becoming the 4th largest. We are, in fact, a powerhouse economy that is integrated into global markets. That's why we've expanded the international trade staff at the Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development and are building up support for goods movement and supply chain infrastructure. With regard to immigration, California is a place where diversity isn't merely tolerated, it's celebrated. We welcome people from around the world who come as students, business people, entrepreneurs, tourists, and yes, as immigrants. The national average for the U.S. is 14% foreign born, but in California, 27% of us are immigrants, and half of us have at least one immigrant parent. Our diversity makes us stronger, younger, more innovative, and more resilient, and has been a primary driver of California's economic success. Of course, as a subnational entity, we don't set immigration policies at the state level. It's the federal government which regulates the admission of people into the United States. But California has disproportionately benefited from immigration, and it's our duty to speak out, to talk about what it means to be the world's largest majority-minority democracy. The third and final of California's international priorities is also the one where our leadership has really been the most consequential: combating climate change. Several years ago, when the Trump administration announced its withdrawal from the Paris Climate Accord, we knew that the global community was looking to California to take the lead, and we did. At home, we proved that we can grow our economy while slashing emissions. Governor Newsom successfully defended our state's authority to set our own emissions policies and our cap-and-trade program. He struck deals with the automakers to meet more stringent emission standards and set a goal of requiring all new cars sold to be zero-emission vehicles by 2035. Every single day, we are taking significant steps forward to power our state with 100% carbon-free electricity and achieve carbon neutrality by 2045. On the global stage, we believe California's leadership on climate is among the most steadfast and reliable in the world. We are committed to sharing California's lessons and learning from others, having signed over 60 bilateral agreements. We have participated in countless technical exchanges with nations and subnational jurisdictions from around the world. With one of our sister states, Baden-Württemberg, we founded the Under 2 Coalition, and we have an active exchange with China on climate that persists despite frictions at the national level. These past few years, we in California have seen that climate action is more urgent than ever, with drought and fires caused by extreme weather conditions. 5 of the 6 largest wildfires in California history happened in 2020 alone, burning over 4.2 million acres, 4% of our state. Now we see that our snowpack is at record levels and our reservoirs are full, presenting the threat of major flooding. I don't mean to scare you, but the general public is aware of the threats posed by a warming planet, and we will persist with bipartisan efforts and a science-based approach. So, trade, immigration, and climate are California's top international priorities. But I think it's also important to mention that last June, President Biden selected Los Angeles to host the Summit of the Americas, bringing foreign leaders from across the Americas here to our state. And in November, it will be San Francisco's turn when President Biden will again welcome world leaders to California, this time to attend the APEC Leaders Summit meeting. Delegations from all 22 APEC countries are expected to spend a week here in San Francisco with APEC Leaders Summit hosted by President Biden from November 14th to November 16th. Mark your calendars. This will be the largest diplomatic event in San Francisco since the United Nations Charter was signed here in 1945. And I hope that we at the state can work closely with the Carnegie Foundation to make sure it is a great, great success. I also want to mention that I'll be leaving a bit early this evening to attend the official opening of the European Union's only diplomatic mission outside of a national capital, also here in San Francisco. EU missions around the world are all embassy level. But just like Carnegie, the EU ambassador realized the importance of an outpost here, and as of today, we are now home to their very first consulate. Director Klaus and President Cuellar, thank you for establishing this new center in California, and we look forward to working with you, to learning from you and your scholars how California can better formulate policies which will have the greatest impact both here in our Golden State, outside our borders, in the United States, and around the world. So on behalf of myself, Governor Newsom, and all the people of our state, we enthusiastically welcome the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace to California. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Lieutenant Governor, for those precise, targeted, but ambitious vision. I'm Ian Klaus, the founding director of Carnegie California, the endowment's new West Coast outpost that we're here to celebrate and open. And we're describing California a little bit as we see it, and I'll offer an attempt. This state, among the many things it does, is it defies metonymy. It can't be captured in the image of a building, locale, or region. It isn't synonymous with a single industry. And because of this, Tino and the rest of the team at Carnegie California, we were often asked, who's your audience? The answer, we don't speak at, we speak with. And we're grateful today to have gathered with a group that includes members of the West Coast Advisory Committee, non-resident scholars, former chairman of the board, Jim Gaither, city leaders from San Francisco, Sacramento, Los Angeles, Palo Alto, and Oakland, among others, key policymakers from the state government, colleagues from Stanford, Cal, UC Merced, UCSF, and the Asian Art Museum, industry leaders from venture capital, Google, Apple, Anthropic, Mammoth Biosciences, and others, civil society groups, both national and local. And we're very grateful to be joined by much of our consular community, including the Consul General from Ukraine, here doing diplomacy in California in person, and we welcome the viewing audience online. We're especially lucky to be joined by Wally Adeyemo. The Inflation Reduction Act was heralded by climate leaders around the world as an important step in addressing climate change, as a return to climate leadership by the United States, and as a testament to the capability of democracies to take bold climate action. But here in the United States, it's an even bigger deal. carrying with it implications for green jobs, infrastructure development, and emission reductions. Deputy Secretary Adeyemo was born in Nigeria, immigrated to California's Inland Empire as a young child with his parents, and is a graduate of, among other institutions, Cal Berkeley. Former Deputy National Security Advisor for International Economics, Sherpa to the G7 and the G20, Chief Negotiator for the Trans-Pacific Partnership's provisions on macroeconomic policy, the first president of the Obama Foundation, Adeyemo is now Deputy Secretary of the Treasury Department. Now, I'm getting the impression that those behind us can't necessarily hear us or your applause, so I'm going to take that advantage to say a little something extra about Wally, which is that, mononyms aren't the exclusive preserve of pop stars or European footballers. DC traffics in them too. And in addition to his formal CV, the Deputy Secretary has become mononymous. Carnegie California is pleased to welcome Deputy Secretary Adeyemo, or a bit like Zendaya, Ronaldo, and Adele, Wally.
Let me just say thank you to Ian for that wonderful introduction, and to both you and Tino for inviting me to join you today for the launch of the Carnegie California. As a Californian, where I know that here ideas are created and innovation is made, it is good to see a historic organization like this one deciding to put roots in this community. And as we all know, Andrew Carnegie started the endowment in 1910 to advance the cause of peace and international cooperation as he saw the storm clouds of war begin to form. And today I want to talk about an issue that I think is as important as the issues that Carnegie started to address. I'm here to address the ways that climate change is today an existential threat, not just to peace and international cooperation, but also to humanity. And in response to that threat, my boss, President Biden, signed into law the boldest step our country has ever taken to confront the existential threat that is climate change, the Inflation Reduction Act. The IRA not only positions the U.S. to meet our climate goals, but provides the public and private sectors with the tools to improve our energy security and secure our economic future. On Monday, just miles away from here, President Biden made clear that government alone cannot solve this problem. It's going to take the private sector, it's going to take foundations and organizations like Carnegie to transform our economy to address the climate crisis, and it's going to require trillions of dollars. That's why the vast majority of the resources devoted to address the climate crisis will be distributed through the tax credits and incentives administered by my department, the Department of Treasury, to help crowd in private investment. The IRA incentives have the ability, by one study, to unlock more than $3 trillion of investment and support 1.7 million jobs. At the Treasury Department, my role as Deputy Secretary has me serving as the Chief Operations Officer of the department. And under Secretary Yellen's direction, my colleagues and I are laser focused on providing the guidance and tools needed to make sure America can reap the benefits of the IRA, giving families, consumers, nonprofits, governments, and businesses the certainty and resources they need to help accelerate the clean energy innovation and deployment our country desperately needs. As of last year, it's important to note that global green investment totaled $1.1 trillion, and about half of that investment occurred in one country, China. Earlier this week, President Biden highlighted the stakes of climate action and outlined our vision for a clean energy future. Today, my goal is to delve into the details of how the IRA will help ensure America and our allies lead the green economic transformation, moving forward and explaining our strategy to accomplish three key objectives. First, we need to do our part to prevent the catastrophe that is climate change from materializing. Second, we need to ensure our transition to a clean energy economy enhances our energy security. And third, to create good green jobs across the country by positioning the U.S. at the center of this economic transition. But before I talk about the opportunities that climate change presents to us in terms of transforming our economy, it's important for us to be clear about the challenges. which people here living in California know well. In fact, we've been dealing with these challenges for decades, but without the resources we needed to address the threat. But today, the IRA finally gives us a fighting chance and the tools we need to fight a battle that humanity cannot afford to lose. I don't need to belabor the point with this audience that climate change is a long-run existential threat to all humanity and to the planet. But as a Treasury official, I would be remiss to not point out that climate change is already exacting an enormous cost on our economy. It's one that people in California know all too well. Last year alone, climate and weather-related disasters cost the U.S. more than $160 billion. Recently, here in California, the risk has become so great that insurers like State Farm, the largest home insurer in the state, have stopped selling coverage. We're also seeing insurers pull back in states like Florida, where home insurance rates are now 4 times the national average, making housing less affordable, making it less possible for working-class Americans to afford a home or to afford to live near to the places that they work. But despite these challenges, we can not only focus on making clean energy cheap and reliable. This transition must also improve our energy security. The United States cannot and should not produce all of the inputs required to build a clean energy economy alone. Take critical minerals, the basic materials needed for a range of clean technologies, from electric vehicle batteries to permanent magnets in wind turbines. The International Energy Agency estimates that the world is already on track to double critical mineral demand by 2040, and more still will need to be produced to meet our climate goals. In order for the United States to get access to these critical minerals, we're going to need to do it with other countries. Today, the supply chains for these minerals and the downstream technologies they feed into are dominated by companies in one country, China. As of 2022, China mines production represents 65% of the global market for graphite and 70% for rare earths. Chinese refining accounts for 77% of global cobalt refining capacity and more than half of global lithium refining capacity, all of which are critical to our renewable energy future. This dominant position is a result of years of strategic investment by Beijing. We know all too well in the United States of America what abuses dependence can produce. We only need to look to the 1970s, where America saw oil prices nearly quadruple in a matter of months as a result of an OPEC oil embargo. And while the worst of these risks may seem like a distant memory to us due to our position as a net oil exporter today, our allies in Europe are still suffering from Russia's weaponization of national gas supplies over the last year, inflicting pain on millions of innocent people in retaliation for Europe's support of Ukraine. We cannot afford to go from a world where our closest allies are completely reliant on Russia for gas to a world where we are all completely reliant on China for batteries. Finally, any economic shift of this magnitude entails risks. Risks that the gains from it occur primarily to those starting from a position of economic advantage. Risks that communities whose economic lives are closely tied to the fossil fuel industry are left behind in the transition. And risk that those most impacted by climate change are the last to see the benefits of the investments we're making. As we embark on this economic transition, it's incumbent on all of us to ensure that the opportunity this transition creates reaches all Americans. That's exactly the approach we're taking as we have begun to implement the IRA, to balance the urgency of achieving our climate ambitions with the need to safeguard our energy security and the imperative to build a clean energy economy that benefits communities across the country. My goal today is to explain how we're pursuing these 3 objectives in tandem and how the many pieces of the IRA fit together in support of that approach. One of the most important outcomes of the Inflation Reduction Act is that it positions the U.S. to make good on the President's climate commitments. In order to accomplish these goals, we must do 3 things. 1, accelerate the deployment of clean and affordable electricity. 2, lower the cost of green products for American families and businesses. And finally, invest in the clean technologies of the future. The IRA will accomplish these goals using a combination of incentives, both on the supply and the demand side. On the supply side, the IRA will boost clean energy deployment and further drive down electricity cost. The success of vehicle electrification, clean hydrogen, and other elements of our climate strategy depend on greening the underlying sources of these technologies. That's why the IRA combines tax credits designed to support the rapid build-out of established technologies like solar and wind, while providing technology-neutral incentives to facilitate the development of new energy sources. Within a few years, these incentives, coupled with ongoing efforts to upgrade our electrical grid infrastructure, have the potential to double the rate of new wind installation and increase by a factor of 5 the rate of new solar installation. American households will be among the many beneficiaries of this reliable, relatively inexpensive clean energy. One analyst found that the Inflation Reduction Act could ultimately lower a typical household's electrical bill by $200 per year. And on the demand side, we're providing consumers incentives that will lower the cost of deployment and encourage the adoption of clean technologies in their homes and lives. This is why the IRA includes tax credits and rebates for critical items that Americans use every day, like energy-efficient appliances and electrical vehicles. Those who use IRA incentives to purchase EVs will see their fuel costs go down by about 60% overall. These actions will not only benefit the US, and it's important to realize this, as the supply of these technologies scale up and their costs come down, people around the world will be able to take advantage. The IRA's investments could reduce the cost of certain emerging technologies by as much as 25%. This in turn will help other countries reach their climate goals and help stretch the resources they invest even further. Time and time again, America's foundational investments in innovation have led to breakthroughs that help not only our country, but also help the world. This brings me to the next pillar, strengthening our energy security. Today, we are dependent on fossil fuels that are harmful to the planet and often priced in ways we can't control in the United States. But we risk ending up with a similar challenge tomorrow if we do not build a sustainable and diversified clean energy supply chain. The undeniable truth is the US cannot build a clean energy economy alone. We need to work with other countries to develop the critical minerals and clean energy manufacturing needed to build a net zero global economy. As a Carnegie Endowment report on critical minerals recently said, partnerships among democratic states would be able to produce enough minerals to enable the world to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, but it will require extraordinary technological and financial cooperation. That's exactly what we seek to do with the IRA. Our partnerships and alliances will build a clean energy economy that will accomplish two goals: eliminating choke points and enabling our companies to compete in a market where Chinese firms and state-owned enterprises have long dominated by virtue of their subsidies and lower environmental and labor standards. But let me be clear. In order to contain temperature increases below 1.5 degrees Celsius, we will need China to continue investing in a clean energy ecosystem. What I'm saying is that the Inflation Reduction Act now gives the US the tools we need to build our own green economy, one with resilient supply chains that do not require us to rely on any one country for our energy security. That is why, for example, the IRA makes part of the clean vehicle tax credit available only if vehicle batteries are built with critical minerals sourced or processed in the US or our free trade partners. One of the United States' greatest strengths is our network of alliances and partnerships, which we must leverage to help build reliable clean energy supply chains to support our green economic transition. It's no secret that some of our foreign partners initially had reservations about the IRA and viewed it as an advancing America's interest at the expense of others. The reality could not be further from the truth. The IRA's goal is not for the US alone to bear the cost or the benefits of these investments. They must be shared by all of us globally, given that the threat that climate change presents is one that threatens us all together. We're committed to engaging and coordinating with our allies and partners to work in lockstep to achieve our climate goals and pursue a shared approach to these investments. That's why we supported allies like Canada in developing tax credits for clean electricity investments and clean manufacturing to facilitate the expansion of Canada's clean energy economy in service of our shared goals. It's why we're working directly with the EU to accelerate investments we must both make to protect our energy security. It's important for us to remember that when we produced the first vaccine in COVID, it was a joint effort between an American company and a German company, with investments from the United States and from Germany. It's the same way we dealt with the pandemic, by working together with other countries and working in collaboration to make sure that we had access to cutting-edge drugs that were driven by investments by our countries, is exactly what we need to do to address the climate crisis. True energy security requires resilient supply chains, and those supply chains must be built in collaboration with our allies and partners, alongside investments we must make to build our own industrial base here in the United States. Our motto must be both and, not either or. But finally, even as we build global supply chains, we are also working to ensure American workers benefit from the green transition in the form of well-paying clean energy jobs. For this transition to be sustainable, the economic growth it produces must be equitable, creating millions of good, clean energy jobs that expand the American middle class. We're seeking to accomplish this goal by providing additional incentives to clean energy firms that do three things. 1, create manufacturing jobs here in America. 2, pay a living wage. And 3, invest in low-income communities and communities disproportionately impacted by climate change. This is a way that is represented by what Secretary Yellen calls modern supply-side economics, which seeks to unlock our economy's unrealized potential by making investments in our labor market, especially in underserved communities. The IRA is designed to create well-paying jobs here in America, which has been at the core of the President's economic agenda since day one, and will be one of the IRA's most important legacies. The IRA includes both direct incentives for companies to manufacture their own products in the U.S., like the Advanced Manufacturing Production Credit, and incentives for companies to buy products manufactured in the U.S. by other companies, like the Domestic Content Bonus, which increases the credits available for projects that rely on inputs made in America. This approach is already working. Since the IRA passed, nearly 200 new clean economy projects totaling $83 billion have been announced in the U.S. Second, we're committed to creating jobs where workers' rights are respected and they are paid a living wage. In total, according to academic estimates, the IRA could raise the wages paid to solar and wind workers by $220 billion per year relative to what they would have earned without it. For many incentives, the maximum amount is only available if companies pay prevailing wages and meet apprenticeship requirements to help expand our green workforce. And by working with partners and allies, we can build supply chains that reflect these same commitments to strong labor rights as well as environmental standards. We're also working to ensure these gains flow to those in need, especially low-income communities and those most at risk from climate change. Even when major economic transitions bring benefits, they can be costly if those gains are not spread. Just look at the way cheap goods from China have hollowed out many of our country's manufacturing communities. The IRA's incentives will help us demonstrate what an inclusive economic transition looks like. We recently released guidance to facilitate the uptake of bonus credits for investments in low-income communities and energy communities as well, including those with closed coal mines or power plants. These credits will help ensure that communities that kept the lights on during the last century are at the center of the economic opportunity during the next one. The goal of these provisions is to ensure that the communities most exposed to the potential cost of clean energy transition are poised to benefit from the economic potential it creates. In many cases, this will mean new green jobs in these communities. In others, it will mean opportunities to access capital and streamlined financing that enable more projects to get off the ground and deliver energy at low cost. I've recently spoken with a number of community organizations that plan to directly access clean energy tax credits to invest in solar power for their communities. On a trip to Atlanta in March and earlier today, just across the bay in Richmond. These credits will help these organizations purchase rooftop solar for affordable housing developments, expand their operations, and deliver energy cost savings to their communities. This is yet another example of how our approach to the IRA is designed to use its many provisions in concert to pursue all of our objectives for the green economy and to share its benefits as widely as possible. Earlier this week, as I conclude, it's important to remember that President Biden had the opportunity to be introduced by a young member of an organization that was built here in California called the Climate Action Corps. And earlier today, I had a chance to be in Richmond at an organization called RISE that brings young people together to fight for climate justice. And yesterday, I spent time in East Palo Alto with the Climate Resilient Communities Project, talking to young people. And it's important to remember that as we talk about these historic policies and their implementation, they don't just matter to us now. They don't just matter to what we're doing to invest in the economy now, but they're about the future that each one of these young people care deeply about, a future that we have to make sure is greener and more equitable, and one in which the United States continues to lead. We believe that the IRA and the investments that the government is making through the Inflation Reduction Act are going to help ensure that America remains a leader in the economy of the future, which is the green economy. And there'll be no place where that investment will matter more than here in the Bay Area, where innovation happens, and that innovation often impacts not just the state of California, not just our country, but our world. That's why I'm so happy to be here today with you and have an opportunity to talk to you about the President's vision for implementing this bill. Thank you so much for your time, and best of luck to all of you and to the Carnegie Endowment.
We are here in this lovely space. There are plush chairs, there are drinks. We are in California. But make no mistake, this is the Carnegie Endowment, that was Wally, and this is wonky. Thank you, Deputy Secretary, for those remarks, for the forceful exegesis of why the IRA matters, of the intersection of international affairs and domestic policy, and the implications locally of that intersection. I'm a Californian, and I experienced one of those intersections and its implications in 2020 during the wildfires. My wife and I evacuated. Like our friends in New York and DC now, we're all familiar with orange skies. A recent Carnegie article, and it was kind of the Deputy Secretary to reference our scholars' work, captured how the experiences of that summer and early fall resulted from climate change, drought, and development patterns with which we're familiar, but also in part geopolitical technology competition between the US and China. Emergency management and resilience, experienced locally, are stories also written at national and global levels. Victoria Salinas is a Chilean-American and admittedly a Texan by birth. The former Chief Resilience Officer and Deputy City Administrator for Oakland, and recently Vice President for Programs and Communication at the nonprofit Fuse Corps. She now serves as the leader at FEMA for Resilience. Technically, the Acting Associate Administrator for Resilience, or that person performing those duties. It is a long title, but I'll also mention, before she joins us with a touch of gossip, a while ago, when I was 14, I asked Salinas to a dance. And she said no. And in fairness, I was 14, I was not yet 5 feet tall, and I had a very long mullet. I tell that story only because we should probably tally up that decision as another piece of evidence of her sound judgment and capable decision-making. In conversation on extreme weather, insurance, federal local engagement, and resilience, please welcome Michael Koren, climate columnist for the Washington Post, and Victoria Salinas.
Shall we say thank you, Ian, for the kind introduction?
And such great judgment. Well, thank you for joining us. So, I'd love to start, I guess, with a little bit about not just you, but about your day. Not many people maybe understand that, and myself included. So, what does a typical day look like for you?
Absolutely. Well, first, I do want to say thank you to the Carnegie Foundation for inviting me. I have deep California roots. Actually, my great-great-grandfather arrived in San Francisco in 1906, the day after the big earthquake. And then my mom grew up in Southern California. I grew up in Austin, Texas, but I was conceived in Potrero Hill, just to be clear. And had my two lovely children in Oakland while I was Chief Resilience Officer there. And so just really thrilled to be back here. And with all the beauty in California, it's also, my now 8-year-old, when the pandemic happened, he already knew about wearing a mask, right, because of having to deal with the wildfire smoke. And even the last week when we were in DC, and we were having those orange skies from the wildfire smoke in Canada, I asked him as I walked him to school, I was like, what does it smell like? And he said, California. Not the best, but just in terms of, there's so much that's going on here, and I think for me in my day-to-day, to your question, my experience having worked both in local government for the city of Oakland, Fuse Corps, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, embeds executives in local and county governments across the country, has a huge presence in California. And so I've had that opportunity to work locally. I've also had the opportunity to work internationally. I was at the World Bank doing disaster risk management. And with the federal government, post-Katrina, now as part of the Biden-Harris administration. And so for my day, I am bringing constantly, I end up with, in FEMA's resilience portfolio, and many of you probably think FEMA and you think disaster response and recovery, and that is absolutely a core function of what we do. But our resilience portfolio is all about helping communities survive, adapt, and thrive. And so we've got billions of dollars in grant programs every year that we're putting out for hazard mitigation, risk reduction, homeland security. We have the National Flood Insurance Program that's helping people transfer risk through financial mechanisms, tons of tools to understand risk. And so my typical day is working with a very diverse set of executives and the programs that they run. And as the political leadership, I'm bringing the administration's priorities to everything we do. And our first priority at FEMA is instilling equity as the foundation of emergency management. And for the conversation here, and even when we think both locally and globally, it's because you have to instill equity as the cornerstone of everything you do when you're trying to build a more resilient community, a more resilient nation, or a more resilient world.
Great, thank you. And so you really have seen it all. You started your career, I think, right after Hurricane Katrina as a presidential management fellow at FEMA, and you're now back there, but by way of the World Bank, and as you said, Oakland and many other places. So given that kind of experience that few people have, what are the trend lines you've been seeing in how FEMA and others are responding to disasters? Yeah,
there's definitely some key trend lines. I think first is one that's already been touched on today and is a common theme just around the impacts of climate change and the increase in both severity of events and frequency of events. And what that means in terms of a trend is at FEMA right now, and I just saw Mayor Schaaf. Hi, how are you? Wonderful to see you. Yay, Oakland. So one of the things that we're seeing in terms of a trend line is that while at the FEMA level, we're mostly concerned with major disasters, presidential declarations, that's not the daily experience. Because of those impacts of climate change, we are seeing local governments have to respond very frequently. Something that can be 2 inches of rain can cause businesses to close, homes to flood, and require a local response. And so the demand at the local level is only increasing. And so that's one trend line that we're just seeing globally. And so while the conversation around climate mitigation, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, reaching our global goals and commitments is absolutely critical, it is insufficient. And so adaptation measures and really accelerating adaptation is one of those trends that we not only has started, like every single year now as we put out our grants, last year we had $2.3 billion in one of our Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities grant. We got threefold the applications for that, right? There's a demand to adapt because the realization that we are already living in those times of extremes. I think another major trend that we're seeing is that we no longer have the luxury of single peril solutions. In the disaster risk management space for a long time, people would think, okay, flood risk reduction, we're going to do our flood project, we're going to do our earthquake retrofit, we're going to do what, pick a hazard, do a project.
All perils all the time now.
Multi-hazard,
Okay.
right? Like today, this morning, I had the opportunity to stop by a health center in the Castro that we did a seismic upgrade for, but we also helped them improve their cooling system. So now when there's an extreme heat event, that primary care center that helps the LGBTQ plus community in the Castro, youth, Latinos, that can be a place that is now part of San Francisco's response to extreme heat. It can continue to keep going. And so it's that idea of multi-peril, multi-hazard solutions, which is all what resilience is about. Anything you do, multiple benefits. And even in that health center, they're really focused on connecting people, addressing the chronic stresses they're facing, right? Connecting people with psychosocial support, behavioral health. And so that's really, I think, the other big trend is that single peril solutions have to be part of the past. You can't just deal with the shocks and the hazards, the natural hazards. You have to be thinking about what drives chronic vulnerability in communities and design solutions that do both. And I think the third trend line that I'm seeing, and I'm really, I think for me personally, the work of this administration has been excellent in the spaces around equity. And when I think about Carnegie's role internationally, and then now in California, I see a huge tie here that makes me think of something my father actually said to me when I was debating taking that role at FEMA post-Katrina, because I'd only been, I'd studied international development. I was like, working domestically, I don't know, I just finished like studying international development policy at the Kennedy School. I don't know about the US, but Katrina had just happened. And what he said to me was, if we can't figure it out in the US, if we can't figure out how to help our most vulnerable people, we can't help others that well. And so if you take this job, Victoria, you'll have that opportunity to roll up your sleeves, work alongside communities, and that experience will help the world. And so that, when it comes to equity, I think for those of you who may be familiar, Justice 40 has been one of the big policy priorities for the Biden-Harris administration. And what Justice 40 is a mandate, a requirement for federal agencies to think about their programs differently. Think about how do we deliver 40% of the benefits to underserved, disadvantaged communities. And that might not seem like a lot, but the fact of the matter is that many of our programs, our federal programs, were designed around protecting property and not people. And so by placing people at the center, Justice 40 helps create accountability on, are we designing our programs, are we delivering our programs in a way that leads to more equitable resilience, which is key from a trendline perspective because of all the data that shows that where we have the most underserved populations, the low-income communities, those that have been disenfranchised by the system, that's where we see the greatest impacts of climate change. And so I think that's the third trend line that I'm particularly proud of in this administration, because it's leading to systemic change and really forcing different government programs to reevaluate how they do what they do in order to better serve people.
Great. Well, thank you. I want to go back to the resilience, but for a moment you mentioned, working alongside other countries. So how does FEMA engage with the rest of the world?
In lots of different ways. And so while we're a domestic agency, you can imagine that every other country has its version of FEMA. And so for a long time, FEMA has been engaged bilaterally, multilaterally with a lot of different countries. In my year and a half back at FEMA, I've had the opportunity to participate in a lot of the UN's convenings around disaster risk reduction. And also, both in Bali, I got to go to COP27, and for me it was very inspiring to see all the great minds and people working on these issues. And what I'm finding in our international engagements is some good news and some challenges. The good news is that when I talk to peers in other nations, I was in Uruguay in Punta del Este earlier this year, speaking with Chilean colleagues, and they, much like California, similar topography, dealing with wildfire, right? Lots of wildfire challenges. And so the conversation is about how do we help each other with better fire prevention strategies and forest management. And so there's that peer-to-peer technical conversation that can unfold. And so that's positive. I think it's also positive that when I'm part of these global conversations, we're seeing the same problem. And that's progress, that we're actually, it's interesting to see that everyone's got the same challenges. We already talked about just the cascading impacts of climate change. The other big problem that everyone's facing is the lack of ability to coordinate in the resilience space. And in disaster response, and we just saw this now with the submarine search, a unified command was created. People from across the world came together to work together in a unified command and start really trying to do the search and rescue mission. In the resilience space, which is focused on, it brings so many disciplines together. It brings together your sciences, your sociology, your economics, and there's so much energy and action in this space, but it is not coordinated. There's not a governance structure that exists to bring it together. And so you have a lot of energy, which is good. You have a lot of resources, which is good, but it's not harnessed. And so that's the other thing that many nations are dealing with, is that there is not the same coordination structure that exists when it comes to helping communities in a nation become more resilient. So those are the challenges, and while we share a common understanding of the challenges, there's also, I think, in the international space, a lot more efforts now to figure it out together, to share how we're failing, to share what's working for us. And so even I'm working with several other of our allied countries to have more regularly have conversations around how we're trying to create resilience frameworks in our nations, and President Biden spoke about how we're going to have a climate resilience framework by the end of the summer. And so lots of lessons learned there and opportunities for exchange, because we're all dealing with the same thing. And none of us have the solution, right? And we all know we don't have the solution, but we know we're not going to get there without talking with each other, without partnering, without having those candid, vulnerable conversations about what we've tried and what's not worked, and what we're hopeful for.
Great. And so I think that recently there's been a lot more discussion around equity, around resilience, and where is this money going? And at the moment, there's billions of dollars that have been through the IRA as well as through other programs towards resilience. But when I was doing my research, it seems like that is nowhere near the actual need. And so can you give us a sense of what the discrepancy is right now between what we need to be spending in terms of resilience and disaster preparedness and then what's available?
There is an enormous gap. So even though between the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law, we have more than $1 trillion in new money that, if every project that's ever done is done thinking about natural hazards, it's all resilience projects, right? Like if it's thinking about natural hazards, cybersecurity, all hazards, they can all be drivers of resilience. But that $1 trillion in federal funds is not enough. When I had the opportunity to hear Secretary Kerry speak at COP to a room of business leaders, and his point to them was, it's not enough, we've got about a decade to get it right, and we need to partner with the private sector. In the climate mitigation and greenhouse gas emission space, we heard already, we know that so much has happened in the last decades to get the private sector to be able to play in that space. The tax credits, the changes in legislations, the incentives, there's so many things that have been done to really unlock that capital. And now we're just at the beginning of the conversation on adaptation and resilience capital and how you unlock that. And I'll give you an example of untapped opportunities. So Puerto Rico, I'm very excited, we funded our first restoration of coral reefs. Nature is a great driver of resilience in Puerto Rico. It's in front of a beautiful area of hotels, not a single private sector dollar, even though those hotels will have nicer beachfront when that coral reef stops the coastal erosion. And so there is so many opportunities for public-private partnership in the resilience space, but we're still in the very early stages of making that happen. And it's the critical path to unlocking the capital needed to do the massive amount of adaptation that has to be concurrent with the climate mitigation that needs to happen as well. And that's not all. I think philanthropy has to play a huge part here too, because we have a participation problem. This administration has done a lot, and in our FEMA programs, as the leader in resilience, I'm constantly asking, like, how are we reducing barriers? How are we making our programs less complex? That's helpful in terms of making it easier for communities to participate. California is lucky. Like, you all have, in this state, a really robust state apparatus that is providing technical assistance and support to local governments. Not every state has that. And so we see even last year, over the last 3 years in our Building Resilient Infrastructures and Communities program, 20% of the dollars have gone to California. You can imagine how the rest of the country feels about that. There's a little bit of jealousy here, a little bit of critique, but when you unpack that, it's because the projects are really good, they're addressing multiple hazards, and that's not something that happens overnight. Communities can participate because of the capacity that they have. And so philanthropy actually has a big role to play here too, because states don't have enough money to build all the capacity they need at all levels of government. It will require that partnership with multiple sectors to address the participation gap and making it more capable for underserved communities to access the adaptation dollars they need.
And so if you think about some of the cities or even the states that have made that jump from not being able to access it to really seeing significant change in a short amount of time, what do they do differently? And can you think of any off the top of your head that actually illustrate that?
Yeah, so nothing is quick. And I think that's especially when we're talking about the decades in front of us where we see the climate science saying that by 2050, we're starting to know what's going to happen. By even 2030, we have pretty good projections. Downscale data at a neighborhood level, things are much more knowable now. And to just give you a sense of what it can take, when I was visiting, for instance, this morning in the health center in the Castro, a lot of things had to align for them to do the seismic retrofit and energy upgrade. There was a bond measure that happened that was for health infrastructure in San Francisco. There was a disaster, fires, that led to hazard mitigation grant program dollars flowing to the state. They already had a project that they designed that they were now just going to enhance. All these things have to happen for these things to come together. And so that's why it's so important to start now. And that's also where partnership is so key at this moment, because the fact we have historic funding. It's flowing in. And one of the biggest critiques we hear and concerns we hear from governments of all levels is an absorption capacity issue. Dollars are flowing, it's going to be finite, they will be spent, but mostly those places that have had the opportunity to build a pipeline of projects are the ones who are going to be ready to take advantage. And so it is that multi-dimensional challenge to really be able to access and leverage the resources.
So one of FEMA's programs, as I understand it, actually helps people move out of floodplains, so buy out those properties, move them out of harm's way. And it's sort of a last resort, as it sounds, also very expensive. But one of the statistics out there is that for every $6 we spend in mitigation, or every dollar we spend in mitigation, we are avoiding far more in disaster response. And so maybe you could unpack that a little bit about what are we spending that money on, and how does it have such leverage relative to some of these last-ditch measures?
There is a lot of research behind those figures, so I'm not going to be able to cite all of it. But I think the important thing to think about and why adaptation and disaster risk reduction have so much leverage when you think about dollars saved is that rebuilding costs money. Just the actual construction project costs money. Economic loss of businesses, of families, having to replace things, your time spent in terms of the transaction cost of rebuilding. There's so many dimensions of cost when we're having to start over. And so that's why particularly the adaptation measures, disaster risk reduction measures are so vital to do, because that cost also just translates into human suffering. And reducing human suffering at the end of the day is truly what all of these things are about, which are baked into, in many ways, baked into those numbers as we think about why it matters so much to take action early.
And when you think about sort of what's possible by the local governments versus federal, I think we spend a lot of time and money on the federal level. What do you think is sort of uniquely possible at the local level that the feds can't do?
There is a lot that I do think that the local level is what drives the future. And so there's a lot of different things that local governments are the ones doing. Land use planning, figuring out exactly how to support their residents, understanding the issues in their communities best so that they can then shape what they're trying to design, what they're going after. And I'll give you an example I heard recently, and California knows this well, in all of this work on climate adaptation, anti-displacement is also huge. And I was in New York earlier this week at a managed retreat conference at Columbia University, and an example was coming up from Miami of Little Haiti. Little Haiti is on a little bit higher ground, and so it's very coveted by developers for safer, more flood-resilient housing. And in the conversation on Little Haiti, the critique that someone was sharing with me was that there wasn't the anti-displacement policies in place to make sure the Haitians in Little Haiti are not displaced as people seek higher ground. Here in California, and Mayor Schaaf being a huge proponent of this when she was mayor, anti-displacement policies are something that the local government has the lead on, and making sure that we are doing development in a way that we're protecting the people who are here and making sure that those who come and those who are here are safe, not just today, but for tomorrow and generations to come.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us and giving us this
It's wonderful to be here. Thanks for having me.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael and Victoria, for that conversation. And in your conversation and Wally's remarks, I think there's a shared affirmation, and this is right and this is good, of humanity. And then the very, very complex connections in the policy world that are needed to advance our shared humanity and equity within it. Carnegie's centers are rooted through scholarship connections and focus in their geographic regions. So with this California effort, this is not parachute policy, and we are not merely interested in flashy issues, though we are admittedly interested in some of those as well. The work will in time speak to our commitment, but today the dedication can be found in the senior leadership and staff from the Carnegie Endowment that brought this together. Dan Baer, Allison Rausch, Allison Markowitz, and Miriam Magdielli from the executive team, Catherine Heidecke, Catherine Buchanan, Diana and Cameron from the tech and video team, the unbelievable team in Washington, D.C. joining us online, and the incomparable Marissa Jordan. We all thank you. We also thank the great team at St. Joseph's. There are drinks awaiting, but we saved among the best for last, I'll say, and we feel a little less guilty running over because of the quality of this conversation. It needs very little introduction, but I'm going to provide a brief one. You've heard, I know Tino as a leader. You've heard about Tino as a judge. Tino has also been referenced as a scholar, but we should mention that he was for 20 years, or 2 decades nearly, a professor at Stanford, that he's a member of the Foreign Affairs Policy Board, and a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, quite an amazing accomplishment, actually. So he is a scholar, practitioner, sort of par excellence. And he will be in conversation with Francis Fukuyama, Stanford University, a senior fellow at Stanford University's Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies, and a Carnegie non-resident fellow. His work on the end of history, prescient at the time, check the publication dates, continues to propel conversation and debates today. A concern with the fate of liberalism has run throughout his subsequent works, including his magisterial series on political order. Frank and Tino, mononyms, are learned, precise, and nuanced thinkers who bring into relief the connections between today's pressing issues: infrastructure, climate, democracy, and equality. Thank you again for joining us today, and please welcome practitioner scholar par excellence, Tino Cuellar, and California's public intellectual of sort of without rival, Tino, Frank Fukuyama.
Thank you very much, Ian. I think you'll agree with me that Ian is ready to host the Oscars, don't you think? I should add that, Ian, that's very kind. I do appreciate it. And the one thing I cannot do is top your origin story with Victoria Salinas. So I want to set expectations as they should be. We're aware that we're the last thing standing between you and a drink, so we'll be efficient. But I have to say, it really is an honor to be here with you, to see so many good friends, and also a number of you who are not my friends. I'm glad that you're here too. And to be here with Frank, who's somebody I've admired for many, many years. And you'll see why. Frank is a supple thinker. He's insightful. He has a set of intellectual tools that span the world. And I want to start then with a question for Frank that will put a lot of our conversation today in context. On the way up here, Frank and I were talking about the disaster that is playing out in South Africa, how you have a highly industrialized economy that's in meltdown because of corruption, because of political infighting, and where you see it in public safety and paralysis around infrastructure, in downturn in the economy. We were talking about the situation in Ukraine, which is absolutely tragic, horrific from an international law perspective, a humanitarian perspective, a nuclear risk perspective. We were talking about China and the US and how the China's slowdown in the economy there may have implications for the US and China long term, but doesn't necessarily make things any easier strategically for the US and China in the short term. China's embarking on a path of probably building 1,000 strategic nuclear weapons in the next few years. So given all that, we're sitting right here in San Francisco talking about California and the West Coast as part of the agenda for an organization that deals with global cooperation and prosperity. What do you make of that, Frank? Let's just start with that.
Well, I think it's important to put what goes on here in California in the United States in a broader global context, because all of these things are connected. If you look at the world as a whole over the past decade particularly, it's changed a lot. The period from 1989 up until roughly the financial crisis in 2008 was one of unparalleled American hegemony. The American defense budget was as large as all of the other defense budgets of every other country in the world, in the economy, in culture, in politics, in the political model. US was King Kong. That has begun to change, and there has been also a decline in the appeal of the American political model. We saw a big increase in the number of democracies beginning in the 1970s. It really peaks at about the time of the global financial crisis. And as Freedom House, which tracks this every year, has pointed out, we're now 17 years into a steady year-by-year decline in both the quantity and quality of democracies. Part of that is the rise of important other great powers that are not democratic, like Russia and China, that have a direct geopolitical impact. A lot of that is actually the rise of different kinds of populist nationalism or populist identity politics, where people are not satisfied being recognized just as generic human beings with equal rights. They want their community, their group to be specially recognized. That's really the basis of nationalisms of all sorts, and so that's going on in Hungary, in Poland, in India, Turkey, and unfortunately here in the United States. And those two forces are, in a way, connecting with one another. So, you know, the war in Ukraine is not just a regional war, you know, very far away. It's connected to this larger struggle over models, where President Putin has said back in 2019 that liberalism as a model for governing societies is obsolete, and he's going to prove it by taking decisive action, you know, in his sphere, and that's very much connected with populists in this country, and we're finding this really weird change in the Republican Party, which, you know, when Obama was president, was very anti-Russian, but now, you know, a large part of it is actually switched sides, in effect, in the struggle between authoritarian government and democracy. And so I think that, you know, there's these larger political trends going on where democracy has become imperiled, and there's a real contest, both intellectual but, you know, in terms of actual outcomes, over which system is going to prevail.
So let me build on that for a moment and think about connecting the dots between that kind of struggle between governmental systems and what happens in a place like California or the West Coast every day. Bridges get built or not built, infrastructure gets fixed or not fixed, technology gets regulated or not regulated. Like, how does that map onto what we're talking about today?
Well, I think I've got a scheme for trying to understand this. So you can map all of the world's political systems on a continuum depending on the number of checks and balances that exist to the action of the state, right? So at one end of the spectrum, you have a dictatorship where there's one individual who makes all of the decisions, really no legislature, no free press, no court system that's really going to block.
That's how the Carnegie Endowment runs, by the way.
Yeah, that's right. That's China. I mean, China is a little bit it's not a complete dictatorship, but basically you've got one guy at the top that makes all of the big decisions. At the other end of the scale, I actually think we have California, where you have a lot of obstacles to actually making collective decisions. We political scientists, classify different political systems in terms of the number of veto points or veto players that we have. Now, I want to make things very clear. It's really good that we have checks and balances in the American constitutional system. That's what makes us a liberal democracy, because the executive can't just do whatever it wants. We're not China. But I think it's also possible to have a few too many of these checks and balances. And if you multiply the checks and balances, it turns into a system that I labeled in one of my books a vetocracy, meaning rule by veto, where you have power spread so far that it's very easy to stop things and not very easy to come to collective decision making. Now, this matters on a global scale for the following reason. The biggest development initiative in the world today is China's Belt and Road Initiative. They're spending, upwards of $1 trillion building things all over the developing world. Developing world needs it. Electrical grids, dams, airports, roads, you name it, and they're very good at this. They get things done very quickly. And they turn around and they say, just like Putin says, liberalism is obsolete, the Chinese turn around and say, the West is in terminal decline. They can't actually accomplish things. Look, we can put up a COVID hospital in a weekend. And what have you done? We'll have to see with I-95, and whether they can actually finish that in 2 weeks. But if you think about it, a lot of it does have to do with the nature of the way we've procedurally structured decision-making in our society that makes it actually very hard to come to collective decisions to provide collective goods. And just to link this to the earlier discussions of the IRA and climate, both mitigation and adaptation, all of those things require actually building a lot of things. And we have a lot of difficulty building things, I think, broadly in the United States. So the average amount of time it takes to get a permit for an offshore wind farm in this country is almost 10 years, right? The backlog in permitting for a number of alternative energy and particularly transmission lines is so long that they basically said no more permits for now because we simply can't handle this. And so I think that it becomes a kind of contest of political systems. We don't want to be like China. We don't want to have a system where there's only one decision maker, but we also want to be able to do things collectively. First of all, because we're facing huge, as was indicated by the previous speakers, we're facing huge challenges, and there are times when we actually need to move forward a bit more decisively than we have. And that's why I think, California is a good test bed for, how to make the system more effective.
We're the world's coming attraction, but that often means we face not only forks in the road that lead us maybe in a promising direction in California, but also some challenges and some choices that later have intense consequences, maybe unpredictable ones. Earlier I mentioned Hiram Johnson, and it's interesting, like around the time Hiram Johnson was governor, there was big interest in expanding initiative, referendum, recall. We're dealing with that decades later. I was struck when I was serving in California state government that there was a provision in the California Constitution describing what happens to a state official that accepts free transportation, which is you forfeit your office. I know there's some in the room who are very familiar with that. And again, it gives you a map of how the struggle back then with the equivalent of tech companies with railroads. But what I hear you saying is that we have to go on almost like an archaeological process to figure out how did all those provisions get there? How did California's Constitution become the second longest in the world? And to ask, what will work better for the people of a democracy like California, like the United States now? And that brings us a little bit to CEQA. Talk to us about why and where that piece of law belongs in this conversation about the efficacy of democracy.
Right, so the California Environmental Quality Act basically gives standing to all 40 million residents of California to sue any project, public or private, anonymously with no statute of limitations. And it's a curious law. The United States is the only modern rich democracy that has what's called private right of enforcement, meaning that in Germany, in Britain, in Japan, if the government makes an environmental law, the government enforces that law. In the United States, for various complex historical reasons, we allow private citizens to demand the enforcement of the law through litigation. There are reasons why that's a more comprehensive system than state enforcement, but it's also an extremely inefficient one. So there have been something on the order of 118,000 CEQA lawsuits over the last decade. And it means that, you talk about vetocracy, in effect, there's 40 million potential veto points in California. Something like only 11% of CEQA lawsuits are actually brought by environmental organizations. The rest are labor unions, NIMBY neighbors, business competitors that basically want to use the law to block things that, are of advantage to them. So, it's just an example of a law that was extremely well intended. Public participation is built into this law. It's absolutely necessary. But, the poorly managed participation can also be a big obstacle to collective action. And I think, frankly, on issues like climate, we need more collective action than we've been getting.
So what does a hopeful story look like for American democracy? Imagine yourself in 10 years, and suppose you're speaking to an audience like this that includes academia, business, state government, consular folks, and you're telling a story then about how American democracy improved dramatically, got to a much better place on all these issues we've been talking about, whether it's the vetocracy point or better engaging people in public decision making without paralyzing government, building infrastructure. What would have had to happen that you think is plausible, that you can imagine happening to get us there?
Well, I think that we need, various kinds of structural institutional reform that are going to require some, really major changes. Just on a national level, for example, having a first-past-the-post electoral system like we have in the United States is one of the big drivers of polarization in this country, especially when both of the parties adopted popular primaries. One of the truths about expanded participation is that it's not necessarily more democratizing. A lot of times participatory processes are captured by well-organized interest groups, and I think that that's really what's happened in the two political parties with the rise of popular primaries. You have a lot of outside money and you have a lot of activists, and they can push both of the parties, to more extreme positions than otherwise. And so there are a lot of cases, all of those, the initiatives, recalls, referenda that you mentioned were meant to give more democratic control over the legislative process that was highly corrupted in Hiram Johnson's day. The problem is that the corporations and the organized interest groups within 20 years figured out how to game that system and how to use these populist measures to actually capture, important parts of the state. And so I can't give you a full roadmap. We actually participated in this California 100 study that was actually going to map what California could look like in the year 2050 coming out of Berkeley. If you want, there's hundreds of pages of vision there, so there's a lot of detail to be filled in, but there are many structural changes that we could envision in this country and in the working of its institutions that I think would make it a much more efficient and effective political system.
So when we think about California and the West Coast in general, there's a piece that's about how government works a little bit differently here, the role of the private sector, some of the innovation we see, environmental challenges that play out a little bit differently here. There's also an incredibly robust diaspora community, and of course you can find it elsewhere in the US, but here it's very prominent. You see the fractures in that community and around the visit of Prime Minister Modi, for example. What do you see as a role for those communities in geopolitics? What role do you think that they'll play in the US in the next 20 years?
Well, I think that diaspora communities have been incredibly important. particularly at moments when there is a democratic opening, right? So and there have been several. My center at Stanford, the Center on Democracy Development and the Rule of Law, we do a lot of training for mid-career democracy activists, human rights activists, and the like. And basically, a lot of those diaspora communities, provide the personnel that actually man new democracies. So I believe the new Prime Minister of Finland is actually born in the was born in the United States. You have a lot of people that have gone back to their countries to serve in very senior positions because they got trained in the United States and they were part of these communities but still maintain these ties. And that is a really important function because the world is not always going to be going backwards. It's hopefully going to be going forwards at some point.
I'm going to end with one question that tries to play that up, because we've had moments in the last hour and a half together where I think we've been inspired, but also moments that highlight just how daunting and complicated and messy and risky the world is. But I want to take you back to 1989. I think it's fair to say a whole bunch of people did not see the collapse of the Berlin Wall in the immediate future in late 1989. A few months before the collapse of the Berlin Wall, you wrote a book that got you plenty of attention, The End of History and the Last Man. And among the many things I can say about that book, which has been sometimes misunderstood, but often rightly celebrated as an incisive analysis, it's fair to say you sort of predicted that the Berlin Wall would fall in a sense. And at the time it seemed highly unlikely. A couple months later it happened. That makes me very interested in what predictions you might have right now. Now during the reception you can tell people about stock picks you have, but for the moment, let's lean into the optimistic side of things for a moment.
Okay, we have to end on an optimistic note. And I guess the thing that I would say is to remind people, whatever the problems are we have with our democracy here in the United States, and I think they're actually quite severe at the moment, there's a real reason why liberal democracy is preferable and why that spreading out of authority and not concentrating it in one individual is actually a better way to govern things. And we've seen two clear examples of this in the last year. In Russia, if you remember, President Putin was sitting at the end of a 30-foot table from his defense minister, his foreign minister, because he was so afraid of getting COVID. And he was completely isolated. He obviously did not know what was going on in Ukraine. He didn't know what was happening in his own army. And he made one of the most disastrous strategic miscalculations of my lifetime. On a slightly lesser scale, zero COVID in China was a very similar kind of decision. Basically, there's one leader, paramount leader in China right now, that's Xi Jinping. I doubt that anybody in the standing committee of the Politburo could actually say, well, Jinping, maybe we ought to reconsider zero COVID. And it took a massive uprising of citizens to get that policy turned around. That would not happen. Mistakes on that level, I think, would not happen in a functioning liberal democracy where you really do have to consult people and you can't have this kind of arbitrary decision making. So states look really strong right up until the moment that they collapse. And I think that that's something that all of us ought to keep in mind if we get a little bit too pessimistic and depressed about the current state of the world.
Fair enough. Before you join me in thanking Frank, I want to thank you again for being here. It means so much to me. Stick around, have a drink, hang out, ask Frank about his stock picks. And I want to echo Ian in thanking our amazing Carnegie team for making this possible. And Ian as well, you're off to a great start. Very excited. To be continued.